Thank you so much for the invitation. I apologize for not being able to speak to you in German tonight, but I am very taken already by this forum that we have here as an amphitheater. I think that's a fantastic space for having such a debate that we are going to have today. Now, coming from Copenhagen, I realize that Copenhagen as a city is probably 5, even 6 times smaller than Berlin. But I have a background as an architect and have worked for the past 20 years as an urbanist or urban designer in various cities around the world. So that is the perspective I'm taking forward. And I'm going to talk about why public space is important. I'm not going to solve all the issues that the minister actually brought up tonight. So I wouldn't dare to attempt to do that. But hopefully by the end of tonight, we can have more of a debate about how to solve some of the solutions here together. What we are finding right now is a sort of paradigm shift in planning these years. And due to all the different challenges that the minister was talking about, we are facing a paradigm shift also when it comes to how we are going to view the city, how we're going to plan for the future. And we are moving away from this 60s, or you could say modernistic systems way of thinking about the city to a much more holistic, integrated way of planning our city, where quality of life for citizens are in the very core, in the very center of our debate. And that is a fantastic thing. All the different challenges that we are facing in today's society can be summarized in a lot of different ways. Some of them are climate change in terms of mitigation, adaptation to the different changes that are happening. I think Berlin could do probably much more in terms of greening the 40% of the public space asset that you actually have in the city. There are economic scarcity of resources that enables us to actually look at the city in a different way and think smarter about how we design things. We actually have to do more with less resources. And finally, as the minister has already mentioned, the demographic changes in terms of how the cities are being urbanized, densified, the aging population, the more families that are now living in our urban centers, the inequality of people living in our urban centers. And all of these different pressures put great pressure and demands on our cities. But I will be speaking about 3 things that I think, in my view, actually combines all of those challenges that we are facing. And first of all, that first point is people. People, as whether we are talking about social inequality, whether we are talking about resilient communities, whether we are talking about the demands of the city, people is at the very core of how we have to understand the city going forward. We have to think about people's needs, and we have to understand the demand of our citizens and design that into the way that we are actually planning for the city going forward. The second theme is, of course, the theme of today's subject, which is really the public spaces. The public space, or the space between the buildings, is where all of these issues, or a lot of the issues, needs to be resolved. And finally, process. Process as tonight, having debates, having a dialogue about how we best optimize the resources, our shared resources, how we best optimize the space as a place. And we are leaving this very siloed way of working in our cities as we were earlier, and working much more process-oriented, quality-oriented, holistically across different city departments, whether we are looking at planning for the region, planning for the city, planning for the actual public spaces, or even down to arguing how the quality of life can be improved at an individual level. So we need to go away from this way of thinking about public space in terms of traffic department, parks department, social department, and so forth, to a much more integrated solution moving forward. So I will give you 3 examples of cities that have worked with these different themes: people, public space, and process. Germany is leading when it comes to sustainability. When I work across the world in different cities, every time I mention something about Scandinavia, or in particular Germany, people know that Germany is leading when it comes to sustainability. You are known for that, and probably the country in the world that has most regulations, policies, processes, and so forth to ensure that. However, I do think you cannot make a sustainable society or a sustainable city with only focusing on sustainability in an absolute term. I think I would challenge the German cities, and also Berlin, to think much more about livability. How does our cities become fantastic places to live, to work, to transport ourselves on a day-to-day basis? And how does these cities become resilient in order to adapt to the changes to go into the future? So that, I think, could be interesting to hear some of your suggestions tonight. What do you think would make Berlin a much more livable city? What are the needs of people? How do we really understand the needs of the children, the young people, the families, and so forth? We need to engage them in different ways. You could say that in one way, there are some universal aspects to people that we can actually immediately build into our design. We walk very slowly, 5 kilometers an hour. We have special ways of orienting ourselves with our senses. We also have social needs, and if we can choose different ways of transporting ourselves or walking, if you were to take a dull sort of street with no frontages or no activities at ground level, and choose another street where there were a lot of activities at ground level, maybe a few places to stop, some nice street trees and so forth, I think most people would choose that route. And we are not water that just flows freely through space. We actually have to design our streets so that we invite very carefully people to walk, to bicycle, and feel safe in that environment. We have social needs. Jan Gehl used to say, man is man's greatest joy. And we are attracted to places where there is a lot of activity already. And we heard that some of those places in Berlin that are maybe overly used, there is a lot of attraction to a lot of people. But maybe some of that activity could actually be spread a little bit better in the city and still connected in a good way. I would still argue that Berlin is in a fantastic position. It is rare that I come to cities that think that they have too much city life. I usually come to places that feel that they need more city life. So you are in a fantastic position, and you should use that to your benefit. Public spaces should be for all. The public spaces of our cities is the living room of our cities. We are becoming, our apartments are becoming smaller. Our households are maybe also smaller. So more and more people are actually coming out using the public spaces to meet each other, to take part of events, but also just to play chess with their neighbor or go to the local playground and so forth. So the public spaces, we have a responsibility to ensure that the cities provide public spaces for all. And in order to do so, I think very carefully the city needs to make sure that we have a vast variety of public space available. Playgrounds, parks, urban squares, temporary places, places where people can engage, and so forth. And we need to think about those places as something which is an ongoing process. The city is never finished. The city is more like an organism where you have to test your ideas and then implement it, measure how it works and how people respond to it, and then refine your design before scaling it up. And that simple methodology, I will show you some examples of that, but that simple methodology, I think Berlin could also apply much more systematically so that the city becomes an urban laboratorium for different solutions. Rather than sitting in the city thinking that you can design all the solutions at a drawing table, go out, engage with the citizens, try to build some of the solutions, make it temporary, test how it works, and then implement it and scale it up. Data and sort of evidence-based design, I think, is another theme that a lot of cities are working with. Again, I would say you measure what you care about, and yet a lot of cities do only measure cars. They have traffic departments, they do traffic counts, traffic prognosis. We have a lot of data on these different things, economic measures, sustainable measures, and so forth, but very few cities actually have data on people. How many people are using our streets? How many pedestrians do we have? How many people are in fact biking? Who are coming? Who are not coming to the public spaces? How inclusive are they? What is going on at summer, at winter time? How can we learn about these urban cycles so that we can in fact make sure that the city is responding to the needs of the people? So really we need to make people much more visible. And having that data that can actually show people and what they do can enable us to design the city in a much more dynamic way, in a much more ongoing way, and in a much more learning way. So the three examples. The first example is from New York, and I've chosen this example because I think it can be a reference as to how to actually include people or make people more visible in your planning process. We were engaged all the way back in 2007 with the Department of Transportation in New York. And we really looked at a vast variety of different things, but I want to show you some images before and after along Broadway, because Broadway was selected for a pilot project process. And here you can see that we had 8% of people moving in cars, yet the cars took up 90% of the road space or the space between buildings available. And the reverse order was the fact when it came to people. 90% of everybody available in the space was pedestrians, and they had very little space. You can see in the image here to your right, the very little sort of island in the middle where people were squeezed together in this very sort of touristy place where people would go and take pictures at themselves at Times Square. This is how it looked before. Lots of traffic in the center and lots of cars. And this is how it looked when it was first pedestrianized as a temporary project, as a pilot project in the summer of 2009. This was done very quickly overnight, but at the same time, we went out together with the city of New York to measure the effect of these pilot projects, measuring how many people were coming, what were they in fact doing, and so forth. And these pilot projects were implemented all the way down Broadway. Here you can see Herald Square before and after. And I think there's another slide here where you can see how many people in fact came. Now, the interesting thing was that we improved the travel time through this space by 17%, because pedestrians were no longer walking into the right-of-ways of cars. We had 11% increase of pedestrians in the area, a significant decrease in injuries and pedestrian injuries and so forth. Much fewer people walking in the walkway, and then more than 70% saying that Times Square had improved dramatically. That, I think, is especially interesting for me, because we hadn't redesigned Times Square, and the city of New York had not put in a lot of granite or had a lot of sort of landscape design here. So what had changed was the geometry of the space. So this shows us again that people are attracted to other people. And the minute that the space is actually activated in a different way, people are attracted to that. They feel more safe, and they can start using the space in a different way. We need to think also about these changes of behavior, because it's not only about changing the space and the actual physical design of those spaces. We also have to think about changing the perception, the mindset that people have. So what the city of New York did was to arrange a series of summer street events where they closed the avenues and had temporary activities or pedestrian and bicycle activities where children could come out, cyclists could use the space, pedestrians could use the space. And I don't know, it's like when you, at winter time, when the lake freezes and you can walk into a space where you can never ever come as a person. It is a fantastic moment that you actually can walk into a space and look at your city from a vastly different perspective. And that, I think, is really, really important, that we start thinking about changing our city as a culture, not just as a place. So one evening when I was there, I walked the streets together with one of my co-partners in the office, David Sim, and we met this family driving down the streets of Manhattan on their way to basketball. And this father told us that for the first time ever, he was able to take his kids to baseball on bicycle. And that is the type of thing that actually changes your life and your life perspective and enables those kids to now grow up as cyclists. So the second project I want to show you, or lesson, is from Copenhagen. And this has much more focus on public space, you could say. Copenhagen has changed a lot. It didn't used to be this sustainable, biking-friendly city that we know it from today. We had a lot of cars in the 60s after the Second World War, a lot of parking in all the streets. But slowly, over a period of 30, 40 years, the city slowly transformed the city center, which used to be much more dedicated to business, companies. A lot of the residential use came in at the time, which gave us a critical mass of people living in the city center. And we also had these pedestrian streets made over a period of 30, 40 years. So now we have much more than 100 square meters of pedestrian space and fully pedestrianized space in the inner city. But we've also developed this network of bicycle lanes, similar to what you have here in Berlin, but we don't bicycle on the sidewalks. So that's something that you should discuss in Berlin. But maybe that comes with the number of cyclists. But again, to me, the most important change in Copenhagen is not that our transport system has changed. The most important change is that the city is much more human. The city is a city where you see people, you have faces outdoors. And that has fundamentally changed the feeling of Copenhagen. The city is now a livable city. You grow up in the city as a cyclist and as a pedestrian. You use the city and different modes of transportation, not because you think about transport really, because you have so many vast options of transport in Copenhagen, but it has become a way of life. And we transport very expensive cellos that might cost 100,000 kroner or something, and we transport that on a bike. But we also transport our little ones inside our stomach. So you see lots of women cycling, even though they're pregnant, or you see lots of families cycling with children. And we do wear normal clothes. You don't have to dress up in spandex or something like that. This could be me. It's not me, but it could be me on my way to work or on the way to beach. And I think that's really fundamentally important, that we think about designing our cities for the everyday life. So we do have a quite remarkable modal split today. And if you even look at the inner city, those numbers for bicyclists are even higher, more than 50%. Again, back to the culture issue, because I was joking a little bit when I arrived to Berlin this afternoon, because it was raining, and I said, thank you so much for making me feel welcome, because we have a lot of rain and snow in Copenhagen too. But really, 70% of the people biking in Copenhagen continues biking through the whole year. And that is not because we are more Vikings than you guys, or we are special species, or something like that. We use our urban habitat in many ways as the same as you guys. However, we do have a very strong culture. So how can we design cities that actually support a sustainable way of living? That is really fundamental. So life has changed in Copenhagen, and even though Copenhagen is a much smaller city than Berlin, I will argue that you can have 5 or 6 little Copenhageners around in Berlin and have a fantastic way of life where you can still utilize the fantastic public space resource that you actually have in the city. It all comes down to leadership. I was very happy about hearing the minister talking about this, because when Copenhagen is acting upon these different policies, it's really from the very top of the mayor's level in the city, all the way down to how high the curbstones are. Copenhagen has had a metropole for people vision that has been adopted by the politician, which has been enabling the city officials to actually implement these policies over a long period of time. And Copenhagen is, similarly to Berlin now, thinking about how we can make Copenhagen the first carbon neutral city by 2025, and yet still accommodating for this densification of people moving into Copenhagen on a monthly basis. The last project I'm going to show you is a project focusing on process, because we need to start working together in a different way. The city as a challenge is much bigger than just the public servants to deal with it by themselves. I was first approached about 5 years ago by the Gothenburg city. And the whole inner city and the whole harbor here of Gothenburg needs to be transformed. Gothenburg is the biggest working town, industrial town, you could say, in Scandinavia. They have the biggest port, they have Volvo, the car factory, and they are losing a lot of jobs, similar to perhaps where Berlin was earlier. So they wanted to have a new vision. And they asked me whether I could design a program so that they could have an architecture competition. And then I said, yes, I can do that, but let me think about it a little bit. And then I went home and I called up some friends, I called people at the university, I called people from other cities in Sweden that I know, I called some architects locally that I know, and I found out that probably the biggest problem in Gothenburg was the distance between political leadership and the civil servants. So I went back to the city and said, I can design a competition for you where you get a master plan, but only if you are committed and ready to implement it. And then they found out, maybe they weren't. So they just wanted some good ideas, right? And this is what we often hear, that you use architecture competitions just to get some good ideas. And really, the whole idea about master planning our cities is really, really an old-fashioned idea. Because we cannot master plan our cities today. We don't know the end result and how things are going to look in 20, 30 years from now, because changes are dynamic. So we designed a completely new process. For me, a shared vision is about deciding on going in the same direction. It is not a document. Now, a lot of you are sitting with a red document in your hand, and that's very nice. But the document is not the only thing. Really, a vision is a process. It's a journey that you make together. So the first thing we did was to have an international workshop. We have 150 international people coming to Gothenburg to share ideas for 5 days in a row. And what we ended up with was not a master plan, but it was a TED talk from each of the 10 teams that we had there. And it was really, really an interesting week because the architects started working in silos and trying to protect their ideas from each other. And after a couple of days, I said, stop! Actually, you are all hired to come here and share your ideas together. And then the city is going to make a framework and a strategy for development moving forward. So you can stop your architecture way of working, and then you can start sharing your resources. And that became sort of a mind-blowing